Welcome, everybody, to this edition of Biblically Speaking, the podcast. I'm your host, Jared Bowman. And as always, with me is my buddy, my good friend, my ride or die, the man with more middle names than anyone I know, Brian Tiberius Haynes. Brian, how you doing today, buddy?
I am doing fantastic. And we're going to be talking about stuff today that I am super excited about.
I know we've got 2 episodes in a row that you were super excited about because they delve deep into history. Yes, we're talking about reasons why you should give the Bible a second look. And we're going to talk about evidence today. Now, next week, we're going to talk about 5 claims the Bible makes about itself. But thinking about that this week, I told Brian, I really want to do an episode that might give people a reason to want to listen to that next episode. So we're going to be talking about evidence, external evidence, internal evidence, things that maybe should. I'm not saying that you'd have to completely just drop everything and believe the Bible because of this stuff, but it might be a reason to give the Bible a second look. In fact, we were just talking about how in scholarly circles, particularly archaeology, there's sort of a funny saying, "Don't bet against the Bible." And we're going to talk about what that means a little bit later. So if you want to know why you shouldn't bet against the Bible, we're going to tell you, but you got to stick around for it. But we're going to do this in a very orderly way. So we're going to talk about external evidence first and then internal. So if you want to bash us on prophecy, you're going to have to wait till the second half, or I'll put a chapter break in there so that you can skip to that one and tell us that we're nuts. Because I mean, I can't believe how many atheists listen and watch our programs just to tell me how ridiculous I am or ridiculous you are. But hey, thanks for watching and being part of the Biblically Speaking family. But we're talking about external evidence. And Brian, you had one you were super excited about. Now, you're a history buff. I'm a history buff too, but you make me look like a noob because you love history. I mean, I think you would live in a Renaissance fair if you could. But there was one you were super excited about, right? And why don't you tell us what it is?
Absolutely. So this is a new discovery, and what's really neat about Bible archaeology is there's new discoveries all the time. And what's funny about new discoveries is a lot of times new discoveries tend to be something old that they found a while ago and they threw in a box and they forgot about, or they threw it away because they thought it was trash. And this one is
Sounds like the end of Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah, we'll get to this later.
And it's incredible. So what they found, I'm going to start by saying it's only about this big, what they found. So you think, well, that's really an earth-shattering find that's this big, but it is. It's actually something incredible. And they found it in digging up a part of Mount Ebal. Now, if you're a Bible student, you know that Mount Ebal was the place where when they talked about the blessings and the curses that they found, that the curses were supposed to be placed for the Israelites. So this tablet, like I said, only about this big, really small. You can understand why and it doesn't even look like a tablet, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's lead.
It looks kind of like a seashell.
Yeah, right. And you can see why it got thrown away. But what they realized was it was a piece of lead that had been folded up. And on the inside, there's an inscription. And this is what's so earth-shattering, is that they found an inscription, and the inscription reads, "Cursed, cursed, cursed. Cursed by the God Yahweh. You will die cursed. Cursed you will surely die. Cursed by Yahweh, cursed, cursed, cursed." I don't know about you, but I kind of get the point of what the message was. Now,
yeah, something is not good going on.
Right. That's right.
There's a very not good feel about this.
That's right. Don't buy this property. If you dig that up and you're buying property, don't buy the property. But here's what's...
That's like, in the movie where the realtor doesn't disclose that somebody died in the house.
That's right. It's built on a cemetery. Yeah, that kind of story.
Indian burial ground, that kind of thing.
Exactly right. That kind of story.
I'm sorry, Native American burial ground.
That's right. Come on, Jared.
Yeah, you're not allowed to say that anymore.
I know. I don't even know how they keep it on YouTube. I want.
Well, I mean, to be fair, they are nowhere near India. It probably was right.
Oh, I don't disagree. So anyway, little tablet. Why is it such a big deal? Because when they open it up and they find this writing in it. Now, of course, like I said, if you're a Bible student, you'd say, "Hey, wait a second. Didn't they actually write out the curses and put them on the mountain?" Yeah. Now we don't know if this is. Yeah, we don't know if this is that. In other words, I'm going to be careful to say it isn't necessarily a declaration. That's not what's so significant about it, in fact, because we don't know for sure if this was something that was written later, if this is just, In other words, we don't know that this is what they wrote. But why is this such a huge deal? Because, go ahead.
I was going to say, and you may have been about to go there, but this is Deuteronomy 27.
Yes, it is. So this is a segment of Bible scripture.
Mm-hmm.
It is ancient. It dates back to the time of the Israelites moving in, 15th century BC era. But the most significant thing is that it is a written alphabetic language. Now, I'll talk just a little bit about the alphabet, and this should blow your brain up a little bit. So the alphabet doesn't exist until about the 16th, 15th century. There's no such thing as an alphabet. There are writings. I don't mean to say that there's not, but they're pictographed. In other words, like the Egyptians or cuneiform, they're oftentimes symbols. They're not where each symbol represents a sound and you string a bunch together and you come up with a word, and you can make up new words, in other words, and people can read new words. So that's an alphabet. Alphabets don't exist until about the 15th century. Now, by the way, if you go to Wikipedia and you type in history of the alphabet, it calls it the Proto-Sinaitic alphabet is the first. Now, Sinaitic, because what's Sinai? Well, that's where the Israelites were. The Bible doesn't say this, but one wonders if the first alphabet in human history is God giving it to the Israelites on Mount Sinai. It fits historically, but the Bible doesn't say that, so we don't know that for sure. But either way, either the alphabet came into existence right at that time and gets used for the first time, or God created the alphabet, which is kind of a neat idea, so that you could have the sophistication of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Now, critics say, no. That's not possible. It's not possible that you could have alphabetic complexity in that time period that someone could have written Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. This little document.
Well, we know for sure they figured out the word cursed.
Yeah, that's right. Well, here's the thing. This is not only strung together as a sentence, but it's strung together as an alphabetic sentence.
Yes.
So the significance here is that, and not only that, it's strung together in a way that a lot of scholars point out is the sentence structure of a lot of the writing of the Old Testament. So the point is, this absolutely confirms that the alphabetic syntax that's necessary to put together a complex work like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy existed at that time. And the biggest skeptic dismissal of the Old Testament has always been, well, we don't think people could write that well at that time. And now we have proof. Now, I'm going to add one more thing.
What's interesting about this, but before you jump on that, one more thing, is we can prove that language was still being, that written documents were still being written in the kind of cuneiform language because of things like the Rosetta Stone. It gave us an insight into reading ancient Egyptian. That was the big thing about the Rosetta Stone, right? And so, on the other side of the Red Sea, you've got people writing sentences like owl fights with falcon over alligator and wolf dog man. And over here, you've got a phonetic alphabet. You've got a alphabet that's based on letters and not pictures that represent letters. So just for the lower IQ people like me, I just wanted to spell out what Brian was saying there. Now go ahead.
Like I said, this is huge, but there's a second thing that's huge about it. When I read the sentence, they talked about God and Jehovah in the same passage. By the way, Jehovah is Yahweh. It's just our anglicized way of saying that word. What's important though is that the Bible critical historians have always denied that the Old Testament was written by one author. And one big denial is that they say, well, sometimes they're talking about God as God, and sometimes they're talking about God as Jehovah. And so the big split has always been, so they're not the same writer, because some call him God, some call him Jehovah. Now here in that little sentence, the same deity is called God and Jehovah, which, like I said, if you're a Bible student, this is kind of like people thought that kind of thing. Well, yeah, and like I said, I studied history in a secular university, and we were forced, to have to learn some of these things. And this is what they taught. that this is what they believe. And it's just been shattered by one sentence that's, again, an Old Testament quote, effectively, one sentence. And it demonstrates that the ancient Israelites, the most ancient of Israelites, saw God, Jehovah, as one person, and that they're talking about the same person, despite the fact that every scholar is going to tell you otherwise. This tablet discovery is huge. It's tiny, but it's huge. It's huge. And it's just something that really is neat to say, these things that we discover from time to time. And as I said, it was something thrown out in a refuge pile originally before they realized it was a folded tablet. This is just something marvelous, just a little treasure that helps us to say, wow, the Bible's accuracy is just remarkable.
When you look at the passage that this is talking about, I mean, they do this in Joshua, but Moses gives the instructions in Deuteronomy 27. And it says in verse 4, it says, "It shall be when you cross the Jordan that you shall set up on Mount Ebal these stones, as I'm commanding you today, and you shall coat them with lime. Moreover, you shall build an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones, and you shall not wield a tool of iron against them." So he wants to build an altar with out of uncut stones, but he wants them to write this message in verse 2. It says, "So it shall be on the day when you cross the Jordan into the land which the Lord your God gives you, that you shall set up for yourself large stones and cut them with lime and write on them the words of the law when you cross over." Now, that's not what we found, but this is the event. Now, in verse 11, this is what we're talking about. That then Moses also charged the people that day, saying, "When you cross the Jordan." So the reason why I read this first few verses is I wanted to show you there's a specific big event that's happening between Ebal and Gerizim. And so he says in verse 11, Moses also charged the people on that day, saying, "When you cross the Jordan, these shall stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people: Simon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Joseph, and Benjamin. For the curse they shall stand on Mount Ebal: Reuben, Gad, Asher, Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali. The Levites shall then answer and say to all men of Israel with a loud voice." So here's what's going on from Ebal. "Cursed is the man who makes an idol or a molten image, an abomination to the Lord, the work of his hands of the craftsman, and sets it up in secret, and all the people shall answer and say, Amen. Cursed is he who dishonors his father or mother, and all the people shall say, Amen. Cursed is he who moves his neighbor's boundary mark, and all the people shall say, Amen." And this goes on and on and on for a while. And that, Joshua has the account of them doing this, but somewhere on this, I mean, they're not necessarily reading these tablets, but this seems to be a tablet with this message written on it, that God has given you this land, and that if you make a god for yourself, an idol for yourself, then God is going to take away your part in his people. He's going to curse you. And so that's why this is significant. It's not just the there's two sides to it. That there's the alphabetic side that proves number one, a book like Genesis, like the first 5 books of the Bible, could have been written in that time frame in a phonetic alphabet. There is a validation of history here that sort of reaches back to the Exodus and validates much of what was said about Israel between the Exodus and the entering into Canaan. And then you have this specific event that gets validated, which as you pointed out, validates that there was sort of a free-flowing idea that God used both the generic name for God, El, or Elohim, and Yahweh, which is his covenant name. So this is actually, as you said, a small thing that's really, really big.
And it's incredible, like I said, that a lot of times we find things like this, and there's just so many testimonies to the accuracy of the Bible, that the Bible is
don't bet against the Bible.
Don't bet against the Bible, which is the historical point. One of the, when you walk through the Bible and you're pulling out different things, you're constantly pulling out things that have a validation in outside of the Bible that are telling a story along with it. Even though most skeptics are going to say, no, the Bible was written much later, it wasn't written by eyewitnesses. Those are all things that can easily be dismissed by just looking at a few of the historical testimonies that come out of the Bible. And they're oftentimes very unique historical testimonies that aren't found elsewhere, but are validated at later times. That's actually a big deal.
Yeah. The interesting thing about what you just said, and I had never thought of this before, that the only book of the Bible that isn't eyewitness testimony, well, I mean, some of them aren't testimony at all, like the wisdom literature, but the only book of the Bible that isn't eyewitness testimony that we know for sure is Genesis, because it was likely recorded by Moses later. And that, I mean, and we base that on the Jewish tradition of how they believe that Genesis came into their canon of scripture, but it was part of their Pentateuch, which literally means five scrolls. So it was part of the original Torah, and that it is the account of creation. But once you get to Exodus, you're talking about eyewitness testimony, and so when you are in Joshua, then you are seeing the fulfillment of this thing that we see in Deuteronomy 27. Now, one of the things is we're talking about claims that the Bible makes. There's a lot of historical events that seem fanciful in Scripture, and I think that's the best way of saying it. But we've actually found evidence, and I'm not talking about chariot wheels under the Red Sea. It seems like every couple of years somebody says, "Oh, I found a chariot wheel under the Red Sea." Okay, well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. More than likely, you didn't. Wood tends not to survive very long in high salinity environments, but the we're talking about biblical events that there is some scientific or historical information for. And one that I know that you are really excited about is the Tower of Babel.
Yeah.
And it's not just a Bible story. There's a lot of human history that gets tied up in what seems to be an event very similar to the Tower of Babel. So walk us through that one.
Yeah. Of course, right before this, we're preceded by the flood. You and I
Mhm.
weren't even going to talk about the flood, but the flood is the most recorded event in ancient
That's more
history.
of a scientific
I know,
episode.
I know. But you're right. You're right. It is.
So,
But from a
yeah.
historical standpoint, I'm going to plug the idea that the flood is recorded in every ancient culture in the world with
Yeah.
details that parallel the Bible. Now that's,
Mhm.
like I said, a story for another day, but that is extraordinary.
And it also sort of explains why you find seashells on the top of
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
mountains.
Like I said, again, not even in science. I don't even want to talk about science. I'm not a science. Tower of
No,
Babel.
that's me.
Yeah. So Tower of Babel is kind of interesting, by the way, that you find most ancient societies build towers up to the heavens for a lot of times the same reason, trying to kind of
Mhm.
reach the gods kind of thing. Of course, you remember the story of the Tower of Babel, that God comes down and he confuses languages. Now, there's a neat little thing that the scholars kind of look at and try to understand about languages and how languages work. And that is the idea of the region where the Tower of Babel would have been. The Tower of Babel we're told, is built on the plains of Shinar, which is northern Iraq, in fact, the map here would be about the bottom of where this map I'm throwing up here is. Now, this colorful map with all these different colors represents something that's sometimes referred to as the problem of the Caucasus. And the problem of the Caucasus is it is the location of more languages and language families than any other place in the world. In other words, you can tie strings from languages all over the world and tie them back to this central location. So, for example, if you look on this map here, there's some blue and purple areas. Those are
Mhm.
Altaic languages that pop up in the Caucasus region. Altaic languages, Turkish is an Altaic language, but so is Japanese. And in fact, it kind of connects itself in some ways to some of the languages that come into North America through the Native Americans there. You have Indo-European languages. You have connections to languages that are in the Middle East. You have so many different types of languages brought down here. Ugaric, which goes all the way to Finland. Different languages, different language families, and they're all brought back to the region. The Bible says all language originates. That's a pretty hefty, if you want to say coincidence, that's a pretty hefty coincidence that it happens that way. Now, by the way, there's been DNA studies, and this is science. I'm not the science guy. But there have been DNA studies that track haplogroups, and they find the haplogroups seem to follow the same pattern as languages. Not a shock, right? That haplogroups tend to go along the same lines as languages. So when you track haplogroups, they're all coming out of the same region too. So we have this immense testimony of a confusion of language in the Bible that corresponds to circumstance that exists even to this day of that region being a connection to so many languages in the world.
Just to put this into perspective, we're not talking about dialects. We're not talking about going to the Northeast and getting that soft wood W sound and kind of the when you hear somebody from maybe Boston say something like woulda, or going down to Texas and hearing a bit of a twang. Let me put on my natural Texan voice here, but hearing a bit of a twang at the end of the word or something like that, the drawing out of the middle syllable. We're talking about complete languages. When you talk about Altean and Indo-European, you're talking about languages that use different rules, different vowel sounds, different consonant sounds. It sort of goes back to the speaking in tongue episodes where everybody that speaks in tongues, they claim to be speaking a heavenly language, but they're using the phonetic rules and the vowel rules, the consonant rules for their language, which proves it's not really a separate language. It's just kind of gibberish in your own language. You're talking about, and I'm not going to say instantaneous because we don't have proof that it was instantaneous external to the Bible. The Bible says it's instantaneous. But you're talking about the evolution of multiple languages in a region that all follow different rules. That would be as if saying that Spanish and Japanese and
Apache.
Apache all evolved with Finnish in the same area.
Right.
There's no basis for the linguistic evolution. This is my science hat. That there's just no basis for the linguistic evolution. And then when you see that the diversity in DNA is following not necessarily biological lines like we would think of in biology, that this evolved into this, but people are pairing off based on the languages that they speak. And that this seems to be the point of origin for the diversity in genetics that we see in across cultural and racial lines. That's a big deal when you think about some of the African dialects that would have evolved out of a base language here, evolving alongside Finnish, which is completely different. This is a huge deal. This is a huge discovery. And this is evidence that this happened right where the Bible says that it happened, somewhere near southern Turkey, northern Iraq, kind of maybe near the Iran border, if memory serves, where the map that you had up on the screen a second ago, that this is a big deal.
Yeah, it really is. And as you said, when we track linguistic evolution today, one great way you do that, you look at the language Latin. You see how Latin, of course, is spoken through the Western Mediterranean in particular, whereas the Eastern Mediterranean had more of a Greek influence, but the Western Mediterranean speaks Latin. You can see as the barbarian invasions occurred to the Roman Empire, a slow change with the French, which has the Gallic influence, and as well the German barbarian become the French
language. Well, the word barbarian, just interestingly enough, comes from the Greek word for babbler. Yeah. Because it was so foreign to the Greeks. I mean, the Greeks could kind of pick up Latin, and the Roman Empire helped with that by making Greek one of the main languages of the empire. I think that's part of the fullness of time the Bible talks about. But that's a big deal. Yeah. That just north of them by a few miles, you had the babblers. The people it took us long enough to figure out Latin. We really can't figure these people out. Yeah. That's a big deal.
Yeah. Well, and the idea is, of course, like I said, the transition to Italian, French, Spanish, ultimately Portuguese, those are all connected languages. They're all within a geographic region and connect. What the problem of the Caucasus creates is you have unconnected language. I mean, language trees tend to have similar words. The problem of the Caucasus, they have completely distinct words. This is how we kind of track the idea of language families. We look at words like father, brother, and we see that they're similar in languages. But when they break apart, we say, well, there's a new tree, a new family of language. The Altaic problem is that you have unconnected words, which doesn't happen naturally.
Yeah. And so, I mean, this is a huge deal. Now, one of the things that I find interesting scientifically about the Tower of Babel, or at least textually about the Tower of Babel, is not only did God confuse the language, but in verse 8 of Genesis 11, it says, so the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused their language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. What we're talking about is not gradual dispersion. If we saw gradual dispersion, what we would see is little pockets of Japanese or something proto-Japanese along that route to Japan. But it literally says, it happened, and then the Lord scattered them over the face of the earth. And so we're not told the timetable, whether it was like he picked them up one night or if he just sort of moved them around gradually. But you don't see little, like you said, you would expect to see these groupings. You wouldn't expect to see Gallic language right above Greek and Latin, but yet you do. And you wouldn't see the Uric language, which has very little to do or nothing to do with Gallic language, Gallic, in the same region, and yet you do, because that it's not a natural evolution from one to the other. And so I'm not going to die on this horse or this hill, but you may have some pretty good explanation for how men were actually moved around the earth, and why you find this burst of language here, but you don't find like a trail of it that goes from one place to the next place.
Yep. The best clue we have, there's a little one verse in Genesis chapter 10 that speaks about in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. That gives you a kind of a clue, but it doesn't really answer the question what happened.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like when it says God destroyed the earth that then existed, and he opened the floodgates of the deep. And what does that really mean? I mean, he could be talking about massive volcanic tectonic shift of the earth's crust, and that the earth literally looked nothing like it did when they came out of the flood before they went in. And I mean, there's just so many questions that this opens up, but it does raise the question: how did all these languages get started in this area? And then why did they branch out the way that they did from that area, not in a gentle rolling pattern where you would assume, okay, one language rolls this way, one language rolls that way, that there's kind of a natural division. But there seems to be after they were born and they kind of figured out, hey, we really can't talk to, or language was confused and they couldn't really talk to each other, that then there seems to be almost this scattering that happens. And it's very strange that both DNA and language go back to the diversity of DNA and the diversity of language go back to this one area of the world.
It's incredible
So
stuff.
let's talk about some other things. I mean, one of the things that and I'm not going to spend much time on this. This is a fairly recent discovery, but and I'm not even going to say that this is something that you should spend, or anybody should spend much time on, you, our listener. But right now, there's some excavation going on at the just north of the Dead Sea on the Jordan side of the Jordan River of a possible site for Sodom and in Sodom and Gomorrah. And what they found there is a researcher by the name of Stephen Collins, and he's tied to major universities. This is not some guy with a hobby that's going out to find the 14th Ark of the Covenant or something of that nature. This guy's doing real science, and he's saying that there's a possibility that we may have found a major city that was bigger than Jericho, bigger than Jerusalem at the time, that was substantial enough in size for its remnants to be left behind, that was destroyed, but in the destruction layer, instead of finding events of a tectonic event like an earthquake or a volcanic event that would have been, magma preserving things the way that it does, it sort of, preserves the human remains and encases them. If you've ever seen Pompeii or anything about Pompeii, there's a movie called Pompeii. I'm not saying that movie, but if you've ever seen a documentary on Pompeii, you know what I'm talking about. That's not in the destruction layer, but what it seems to be is a massive multi-megaton aerial burst, like the Tunguska event in Siberia that leveled 50 miles of forest. This seems to be something very similar to that, and I'll post a link to it in the show's description. I mean, do with it what you will, but it's interesting that right now you've got four universities. I'm not necessarily calling them major universities, but four universities that are pouring money into studying this site and asking the question, well, why aren't we finding a lot of human remains? Why was this city just leveled as opposed to being burned with fire? And it seems to be the kind of event that we would see in the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But that raises sort of some interesting things about how the Bible states that things are history that for a long time we said weren't history. Now we're going to get into some world shaping ideas in just a minute, different civilizations, different cities, but I mean, in 2015, we found King Hezekiah's signet ring in a garbage dump right outside Jerusalem. And dating it, it goes back roughly 2,700 years. So exactly the time that Isaiah said King Hezekiah lived. Now, I can remember, when they named Hezekiah's tunnel after Hezekiah, that there was some debate in scholarly minds even then over whether or not King Hezekiah ever existed, or if he was a major king, or was the Bible true? And here we find a king's signet ring in a garbage dump. I mean, don't throw away your trash in Jerusalem, folks. There may be money in that trash. But they find this major piece of history confirming that Hezekiah was, in fact, a king in Judah. Now, I can remember, probably not in my lifetime, but I can remember having read articles dating back, I would say probably to the 1930s, maybe 1940s. I'd have to look them up, where people were doubting whether or not there ever was a Davidic line, or a Davidic or a Temple of Solomon, or all of those things. And for the longest time, the people that rule over that pocket of Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock is built on top of the Temple Mount, and as sort of a desecration of not necessarily desecration, but just kind of thumbing their nose at the Jewish religion and saying, oh, this is one of our holy sites. Islam tends to do that. They do the same thing with Jesus, that they want to say, well, Jesus is our holy man. We can't tell anything about him or anything that he said, but he's our holy man. Okay, no, he's not. Well, they did the same thing with the Temple Mount. But this idea of we can't let you dig there, but all around that site, we do find things related to Davidic dynasty. We do find things related to Jewish civilization, temple worship at the time. And so think about this for a second, Brian. You've got this list of kings. I mean, we found the David inscriptions. We found tablets. I'm trying to remember which kingdom which part of their junk it was. I think it was Assyria. An Assyrian tablet, if I'm not mistaken, that mentions King Ahab. We find inscriptions about Jehu and Ahaz. And I mean, these are all guys that at one point in time, somebody said, nah, there's no evidence that there ever was a King David or a King Hezekiah. I mean, that's just something biblical. And yet when we find it, nobody goes, oh, well, the Bible was right. Maybe we should take a second look. It's like, oh, well, of course there was.
Yeah.
Most of the time when we find this, we're not intellectually curious enough about what else does it mean. So let's talk a little bit about that.
It's kind of interesting. You're talking about signets. Of course, the terminology of what we actually find we're not finding the ring itself. We're finding what's called the bulla of the ring.
Yeah.
You took a piece of wax or a piece of clay and you put it on a document and you stuck your ring into it, and that's the bulla, the clay piece. Yeah. So what's fascinating?
It's an impression of the signet ring, but it's still indication that it existed.
And it shows us what the ring was. It's an impression of the ring, and we find dozens of, hundreds of. And I was just looking at a list of all the ones of people that are mentioned in the Bible, and it's too many to say on the air. That in other words, they're kings of Israel, they're family members of kings of Israel, they're people that get just one mention in the Bible, kind of thing. But the point is, we're finding document after document after document of these people and the things about who they are. And it's a constant verification of these things, so that the kingdom of Israel, going back to David, and you're exactly right. I mean, is it the Moabite stela that mentions the line of the house of David, which is actually the events in 1 Kings chapter 1 and chapter 2 of the Moabite rebellion. That just time and time again, we're finding other references to these people. You mentioned Jehu. In the Assyrian record of Jehu, we actually have a picture of Jehu. They actually have carved Jehu out, bowing down before the Assyrian king, an event that's mentioned in the scriptures. When it talks about Hezekiah, years ago, I went to the British Museum, and in the British Museum, there's a document written by the king that attacked Israel. And that's a story that's talked about in Chronicles, in Kings, in Isaiah, where they tell the story of the Assyrians besieging them. The Bible says that the angel of the Lord struck down 200,000 people. That's a historical event. In other words, the Greeks wrote about that when they were saying, hey, did you know 200,000 Assyrians were killed? And the claim was it was a plague sent by the gods. That's what the Greeks said. The whole point is that like you said, it's almost funny that again and again and again, in this debate of is the Bible legitimate or not, again and again and again, the Bible comes up smelling like roses. Nobody says, "Well, I guess I was wrong." They say, "Yeah, but how about this thing?" And that one comes apart. Yeah, but this thing. It's tiring debating with somebody who won't acknowledge that they keep
Yeah.
getting poked in the eye over these things time and time again. The Bible constantly comes up with veracity to its historical nature and its relevance and its authenticity. That the Bible is demonstrated time and time again as having been written by people who are, you mentioned Genesis being an exception, who are eyewitnesses to history, who are eyewitnesses and describe the living and the lifestyle of the times. There it is, the House of David. I see the House of David mentioned right there.
Hmm.
So that's, again and again and again, somebody says, "What? There's no proof of it." Boom, proof. Well, okay, but how about, and that's a miserable way to have to go on with things.
Well, it really is, and it gets frustrating at some point. And I think the thing that probably frustrates me most, and this isn't one that we even talked about, but it's all in the pre-show. But it's all the New Testament inscriptions. It's Tacitus mentioning that Jesus received the extreme Christus extreme received the extreme penalty, under Pontius Pilate, during the days of Tiberius. That I mean, there are people today who would still debate Pontius Pilate whether or not he was even a governor of Jerusalem at any over that region at any point in time, when Roman historians say yes. I mean, Tacitus is he was a general and a major Roman historian. You're arguing with written documents that were written within the time. In fact, I had a guy, and I think he sort of acknowledged that I was right, to call me out just yesterday on one of the I think it was on a short that I did, to say that Josephus and Tacitus were not contemporaries of Jesus. And so I looked up the definition of contemporary. It means within the same period of time. It doesn't necessarily mean that they knew each other or that their lives even overlapped, even though Jesus's and Josephus's could have overlapped a little bit. Josephus, depending on if we got zero correct on the Gregorian calendar, that Josephus and Jesus could have overlapped by about a year. So Josephus would have been really young, not a historian at that time. But it is contemporary. It's within a generation of these things happening. You've got Tacitus and Josephus writing about Jesus, and that you've got a Roman historian who's got no reason to validate that Jesus was crucified by the Romans at all. There's no reason to write about that historically, because he's not a Christian who's writing about it from, philosophically. But historically, he's making this record of this group of people that he considers to be a most mischievous superstition that's causing trouble in Rome, and that Nero blamed for the destruction of the burning of Rome. And it's just things like that. We keep finding things, and I'm not talking about ossuary boxes that might or might not contain the name of James, the brother of Jesus. I'm not talking about things that can't be validated. I'm talking about documents that historians use today. People go to Josephus to talk about the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 because it's an eyewitness account. He was there outside the city with the Romans watching it happen. That this is, as a prisoner, some people say he was a turncoat, whatever. He was there. He saw it happen. He was there. That when you say there's not you, but when they say there's no evidence for the Bible, it's like, except for this, except for the bull of Hezekiah's signet ring that we actually found in an archaeology site and not for sale in some market in some Middle Eastern country. That there's no evidence except for David's name being carved in this rock, that he whooped up on us, that except for this tablet that was found on Mount Ebal, that is a recognition that God was going to curse the people if they didn't stay true, and it might have been a souvenir that they distributed. Who knows why a lead tablet was there, but it's got the words on it that prove that yes, an alphabet exists, except for, how about world-changing civilizations? One of the ones that just blows my mind, that I remember hearing as a kid, even though it was the evidence had been found in the late 1800s into the 1900s. I still remember hearing scholars saying that prior to these things, that most people didn't believe that the Hittite civilization existed. In I think it was the mid 1800s, we found a tablet that was a trade agreement between the Hittites and Assyria, if memory serves. And it was a little document that talked about the Hittites. Well, all of a sudden, everybody says, well, that's not the Hittites of the Bible. But the Hittites of the Bible are a very confusing people because they go from being a world power that seems to rival Egypt to being these little pockets of people over the course of roughly 1,000 years or so. That they're about 1,000-year civilization. They tend to hit the peak of their civilization, it seems like, right about the time of the Exodus, maybe a little bit before. And then after the Exodus, they're on a downhill slide to the time, but they tend to seem to exist until about the times of the Davidic kings. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what the Bible discovers. It tells us that not just that events happen, but that the civilizations evolved the way that it says that they did.
What you're actually talking about is a very sophisticated demonstration that the Bible.
Well, if I had a tie, I'd straighten it.
That's right. That's right. Sophistication is our middle name.
That's right.
Not sophisticated.
Not is our first name.
Not is our first name. You know what's interesting about the Bible, and it's a very subtle thing,
unsophisticated,
but it's actually tremendously weighty, is that the Bible courses through the course of the Bible. And Bible students know what I mean by the course of the Bible. The Bible is a narrative that goes over a period of about, if you're going to start with Abraham, let's say we start with Abraham, we move up till the Israelites are set free. So you're talking about 1,500 years. But there's a lot of people, most skeptics will say, oh, this was all written at the same time. They usually say it was written during captivity or post-captivity. They don't deny the captivity anymore because there's so many documents about the captivity from the Persians, from the Babylonians, from the Assyrians. That you can't deny the captivity happening. But they'll say, okay, that's when the Bible, that's when these things were written. But there are things written in those periods now, from Abraham's time on, that are historically specific to those times. So we start off with Abraham and the city of Ur. Now, the city of Ur is another Hittite story where there's no city of Ur. Now we know that the city of Ur is an ancient Sumerian city that in the time that Abraham supposedly lived is one of the most powerful cities in the world. So that little inclusion. It
just happened to be in the region of where Babylon would be later.
That's right. And it's actually
which is why it was the Chaldees.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's a part of that early Chaldean empire of Hammurabi that now we kind of have a connection. And we have this testimony of a city that is lost to history. Now, this is important. It is lost to history after 1000 BC. So if somebody that lives after 1000 BC, you've never heard of Ur. You go to Ur, there's nothing there. You don't know anything about Ur. So that a guy, if the skeptics were right, and this guy lives
You're not going to unearth anything.
Oh.
Preacher jokes, folks. The only jokes worse than dad jokes.
Oh.
Brian's groaning because he didn't think of it.
That's exactly right. Yeah. You've got this incredible story of Abraham. And then, of course, Abraham's connection with the Elamites, and which are the power at that time. If you remember the Chedorlaomer and the battles that are going on there.
Oh, who could forget Chedorlaomer?
Yeah, great names, right?
Yeah, named after cheese.
What's so incredible is that this is demonstrating what we now know to be an accurate representation of the world 1800 BC. That, the Egyptians are the major power. The Hittites are now a lesser power. The Neo-Babylon or the ancient Babylonians are there too. And you have Abraham right in the middle of this. I've kind of drawn a picture of a map here, so to speak, in my mind. But Abraham dwelling in the midst of all these things and the contingent of all these things, it's written with a mindset of a accurate historical representation of what was going on at that time, things that would later be forgotten by other historians.
Well, not just forgotten, completely erased. I mean, wasn't that the point of it? Is that one civilization like to erase another?
So an excellent example of that is Nineveh. So when you read about Nineveh in Jonah, Nineveh is the greatest city in the world.
Yeah, a city that many scholars said didn't exist.
Yeah, they were thinking it was made up. Here's what's incredible, though. So there's back in about the 2nd or 3rd century, there's a Greek army that is fleeing. They've been fighting for the Persians and they're trying to get back home. And they're rushing through Mesopotamia, running up the rivers, trying to get into what's today Turkey so they can go back home. And they come across these ancient ruins and it's Nineveh. They don't know that though. And they're saying, what is this ruins? And they're asking the people that live there. The people who live there, oh, we don't know. Nobody knows where these ruins are. What does that say? Well, that testifies to this idea that these aren't things that were written much later because they've been lost in history. When you walk through the Bible in the Old Testament, you're following a progression in the Bible of ancient civilizations surrounding the story. And that's kind of neat because it's not what the story's about. I mean, the story's about Israel, but the things that surround it are telling us stories of the decline of Egypt. We now know that we call it the Bronze Age collapse, and the Bible has tons of information about that. The Bronze Age collapse, the rise of the sea peoples, these different little things. We see the ascendancy of Assyria in the Bible.
Not an attack. That's not an attack by mermen, right? The rise of the sea people.
Rise of the Sea People. That'd be a great movie title, right? For Aquaman's next movie.
Yeah, that sounds like a B movie to me.
Yeah, it does. And so you have this, the Assyrians and their ascendancy. The Bible charts it very, just specifically, right up until the time the Assyrians come right down on top of Hezekiah. And again, we have a historical document of the Assyrians that testifies to their surrounding Jerusalem and then letting it go. And of course, like I said, we have other historical documents that are testifying to what the Bible says about the army being wiped out, the entire army being wiped out. Testimony after testimony after testimony. And like I said, what's important to understand is that the Assyrians become lost to history in a large way. So the Bible couldn't have written about these things later on. The Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. Boy, the Bible gives some of the best testimony about Nebuchadnezzar, somebody we weren't too sure about. We knew he existed, but we didn't know much about him. And now we know quite a bit about him through the Babylonian Chronicles, which tell the story of him conquering Jerusalem, just like he told us, just like he said. The rise of the Persians. Daniel is an eyewitness of the rise of the Persians. And we just have, sophisticated moment after moment. The Bible in its engagement with the Persians, some of the testimonies about Cyrus in the Bible are
the mention of him in Isaiah.
Well, that's a prophecy, right?
Yeah, you're talking about 140 years before Cyrus was even born. Isaiah is saying, oh, yeah, this is going to be the guy that lets Judah come back to Zion, and that he's going to be my servant. He's going to do the work of destroying Babylon. It's like, wait a second, what? I mean, think about it. Think about if I could name the president that gets elected in, well, not this next cycle. That might not be too impressive, but let's say the president that gets elected in 2032. If I could name the person, who they're going to be, what platform they're going to run on, what party they're going to be from, and what some of the major things they're going to do. If I could name that would be pretty impressive.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's probably not somebody that's even on anybody's radar right now.
Well,
and that's pretty impressive. And yet the Bible does that with Cyrus. But even the mention of Cyrus, that here's this Medo-Persian king, and that, did he exist? Did he not exist? Well, here's evidence he existed.
But here's 150 years before it happened. That's what's really remarkable, is that Cyrus hadn't been born yet, and the book of Isaiah is talking about him. A skeptic's going to say, oh, that was written much later. But again, what's so neat about the book of Isaiah is it's making a chronological record of events specific to that time that in the time of Cyrus are no longer discussed. So again, it's actually doing something super sophisticated. And a lot of times when you read the Bible, you kind of read past this. You're reading like names of places and things, and you're like, okay, you went from here to here. That's fine. That's actually a tremendous testimony that's called a falsifiability. In other words, the Bible is opening itself up saying, hey, did this really happen? Here's how you make the trip from Jerusalem to Rome, let's say. And let's pause for a second. I'll come back in just a moment. Let's go to Acts 26 or 27 in our minds and go through that trip. When I was younger, I remember you'd read through Paul's trip and I'm like, oh, okay, this is not too exciting. I want to get to where he's working miracles and he's preaching. But that little sailing trip is a tremendous historical value because there's always been a question, does this accurately describe? Well, over time we found that this actually is this very sophisticated and accurate description of a Mediterranean voyage in the first century AD. Meaning, if you don't believe in the Bible, you'd have to believe that whoever wrote Acts 27 in the first century took a ship across the Mediterranean. In other words, it was an experience. It wasn't somebody making it up. And you run into that in the Bible. Now, why is that such a big deal? Let's go to the Book of Mormon. So the Book of Mormon starts off with the story of the guy's name was Sam, right? I'm probably going to say Sam Wise if I'm not careful. The first guy you meet there,
I can't carry the ring, Mr. Frodo, but I can carry you.
I get the two books mixed up. They're
They're both fiction.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One's more interesting. But here's the thing about the Book of Mormon. And let's slam it for a second. When you follow this story, you're going to towns that don't exist, crossing rivers that don't exist, going to mountain ranges that don't exist. It's clearly written by somebody.
Building boats that man has to tell God, we'll die if you put us in this boat.
But the biggest idea is, from a historical standpoint, there's no geographic or historical testimony to any of the events in the Book of Mormon. In other words,
Right.
there's nothing there. So when somebody says that's true of the Bible, when you look at a book that really it is true of, you should be thinking, well, that's not at all true about the Bible. Every city, if you go from Jericho to Antioch, or if you go from Jerusalem to Egypt, the Bible is recording places and things that you run into and experiences that you have that demonstrate that whoever wrote that made that trip, that had been there, was an eyewitness of these things. And like I said, when you grab a book like the Book of Mormon, which is written much later, which claims to be in those time periods, and none of it is accurate, you realize, wait a second, the Bible's always been telling the truth. And sometimes that false testimony
Don't bet against the Bible.
Yeah, that's it. Don't bet against the Bible. The Bible is this phenomenal testimony of accurate things geographically. And as I said, we oftentimes just don't even think about the geography of the Bible, just as it's kind of interesting. But the geographical testimony of the Bible is so profound because it's demonstrating for us much later that this is written by people that were there, that are eyewitnesses of these things. And as I said, from a historical standpoint, we're not even talking about the supernatural aspect. That's another show. But the historical testimony from that is irrefutable, that the Bible is written by eyewitnesses of the events it claims to be written of for 1,800 years.
Well, you mentioned Jericho a second ago. I mean, Jericho was like Nineveh. It was another one of those cities that we said there's no evidence Jericho ever existed. It doesn't make any sense. And yet, when we unearthed Jericho, we found, oh, wait, the walls collapsed exactly like the Bible said that they did. That here's evidence of a city that had some sort of structural collapse around the walls. And you had an outer wall and an inner wall, and the outer wall fell in such a way that they could actually scale what was left of the inner wall pretty easily. And it's a city that's built on the hillside. And so you have this evidence that, okay, this is, I mean, it's just like going over now and seeing that what's left of the library of Ephesus, or the one of the amphitheaters that they had there, that you see this and you say, okay, this is evidence of an ancient civilization. Nineveh is such a cool one because Nineveh, somebody built a shrine there sometime in the medieval period that says this is the tomb of Jonah, even though Jonah didn't die there. It was a memorial to Jonah, that there was a cultural remembrance of this was the site of Nineveh. And people, modern scholars denied it until about 1847, I think it was, when they started first finding the first pieces of, Mesopotamian, Assyrian statuary there. And when they unearthed it, I think it was completely unearthed by 1950, if memory serves. They found these giant statues of like winged lions with men's heads on them. And oh wait, this wasn't some little shrine out in the middle of the desert. Underneath all of this layer of deposit and debris, there's actually a fully functioning city that used to be here that was a very large city. this imagine if Houston, Texas, or Portland, Oregon, 1,000 years from now, somebody said, "Oh, there's no evidence that Portland, Oregon, ever existed." It's there's no evidence that some coastal city like Tampa, Florida, ever existed. And then you go and you unearth highways that lead into it. You unearth, well, I guess nobody has paper documents anymore. You unearth computers that are non-functioning, but they have little seals on them that say property of this city government. That you unearth, somebody's desk plate that said, Department of Recreation. It might not seem significant to know that this person is part of the Department of Recreation, but you would say, okay, well, this city actually existed. We're finding the names of kings like Cyrus and David and Nebuchadnezzar, and like you said, the carving of Jehu, that these are significant figures. These are people that the Bible said are not only existed, but that they were history shaping figures in their day, that for generations people said, oh, that's just part of the biblical narrative. It was written after the captivity. We're finding a bulla of King Hezekiah's ring that goes back 2,700 years to be, and like you were just saying, that when a conquering civilization, the reason why it was so hard to know anything about the Assyrians was when the Babylonians conquered them, they wiped them out. They blotted out the name of the previous civilization because the glory only belonged to that king. It's kind of like the Ozymandias poem that was common. And yet the Bible is saying, no, all of these existed. But one of the greatest things about the Bible, and we don't have a lot of time to touch on this, but I do want to touch on it some, is the internal evidence. Not only do you have Cyrus being called by name that we mentioned, but you've also got, in the book of Daniel, chapter 8, Daniel is told exactly the names of the next 4 empires that are going to reign. And when you look at that text, and it just says, this is Daniel 8, 20 and 22. This is the God explaining the vision of the ram and the goat. It says the ram represents the Medo-Persians who will conquer the Babylonians. So you got the Babylon's already there. They're going to be conquered by the Medo-Persians. The goat represents the Greeks. The Greeks will conquer the Medo-Persians. And a great king will lead the conquest but will die, and 4 other lesser powerful kings will divide his kingdom. So that's pretty specific.
Right.
That in a day when the Babylonians are still reigning, I mean, think about Nebuchadnezzar's dream in chapter 2. Daniel's given the succession of world history. The Bible records things that our historians forget because the victor writes the history. And yet the Bible records it with perfect clarity. This is historical. This is real. These people existed. Think about, I've got an article I wanted to share with you. Think about the prophecies of Jesus. I mean, by some estimates, there's as many as 456 prophecies of Jesus. But if we were just to take 8 prophecies, what they call the main 8 prophecies of Jesus, and I'm going to list these out for you. That in Micah 5:2, he's going to be born in Bethlehem. In Isaiah 7 and 14 and 9 and 6 and 7, he's going to be born of a virgin. The Messiah would be of the lineage of King David, according to Jeremiah 23 and 5. Zechariah 11 and 13, the Messiah would be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. The Messiah would have his hands and feet pierced, Psalm 22 and 16. The people would cast lots for the Messiah's clothing, Psalm 22 and 18. The Messiah would appear riding a donkey, Zechariah 9 and 9. And the messenger would be sent to herald the Messiah, referring to John the Baptist. That's in Malachi 3 and 1. Those are called the big 8 prophecies of Jesus, right? We know, because we have evidence of some of those prophecies going back to before the time of Christ. We're talking about Dead Sea Scrolls here. That we've got almost a complete book of Isaiah, missing a few sections and chapters, but the most complete book of Isaiah that's ever been found, that that's called the Great Scroll. And we know that these things go back at least 700 years before the time of Christ, or 500 years before the time of Christ, because I think that's what the scroll dates back to, if memory serves. That they're written 700 years before the time of Christ. One guy did the math on that, and he did things like calculate the suspected then world population, and then that singling out just one particular city in the world that would apply to. And the math worked out like this, that it is, for those 8 prophecies to have been fulfilled, it is 10 to the 17th power. So 10 with 17 zeros after it. That's the likelihood. I mean, if you've got a 1 in 10 to the 17th chance of this working out, your odds are not very high. If you expanded that to what's called the Big 48, this is not Erdesheim's 456 prophecies, but 48 prophecies, that number becomes 10 to the 157th power of Jesus fulfilling all of those things. When you expand that out to the conservative estimate of 456 prophecies about Jesus, the number's too big to calculate. I mean, you can calculate it, but it wouldn't make any sense to us if we said it. That's a big deal. I mean, mathematically, that's a big deal. And when you stop and you think about historically, the Bible is saying these things are true. That the Bible prophetically is saying, and the Bible is written by across about 1,500 years or so, no, more than that. It's going back to Moses.
That's about right. It's about right. It's maybe
1,700 years. You got over 40 different authors, 66 books, 4 different languages. And yet to have something prophesied 700 years before, that a gospel writer who, they were fishermen. They were, one of them was a stooge for the Roman Empire, collecting fees for the Romans. The Jews really didn't like him all that much. That one of them was a zealot. I wonder what that conversation was like. But these are not historians. These are not guys versed in Old Testament prophecy. They're going, oh, I better copy down these 8 things, or these 48 things, or these 456 things, and make sure. That's not how it was. And that's something you got to think about, that you got to answer at some point. That we know that many of these prophecies go back at least 500 years before the time of Jesus. If the Bible's correct, some of them reach back well over 1,000 years before the time of Jesus. Things that he said, things that he did, things that he would be. And all of them point to the Bible's authenticity. Mm-hmm. And that at some point, you got to answer the question. If Nineveh existed and Jericho existed and the Hittites existed and the kings of the Davidic line existed, and there's obviously a division at some point between northern and southern tribes, and the language existed, and the division of language exists, just like the Bible says, at some point you got to say, okay, there's more to this than just another world religion that's a fable or a fairy tale. The Bible is not built on fables and fairy tales. The Bible is built on historical evidence. What do you want to talk about when it comes to prophecy, Brian? I know we're sort of over time, but I don't want to be just the only guy that takes all the prophecy.
No, Daniel's the guy I like talking about the best, because
let's talk about Daniel some.
Daniel is such a remarkable story. By the way, Daniel is the most hated prophet by secular historians. They absolutely cannot stand to place Daniel back in ancient times, because Daniel's prophecies are so clear. Like I said, you don't have to be much of a historian to kind of watch the progression of the things. And you mentioned the kingdom of Alexander the Great and how that's broken into 4 kingdoms, the diadochi, that the concepts in the book of Daniel, just remarkably accurate. And it's hated because it is so clear, and that Daniel, as an eyewitness of these things, brings us tremendous information about it. Daniel's the guy I like talking about the most. You mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls, though, and I think the Dead Sea Scrolls are another thing that are worth anybody sitting down and looking into and finding out just how incredible the transmission of the Bible has been throughout time.
Yeah.
Because, the Dead Sea Scrolls are the proof that the oldest argument against the Bible, well, it's been copied and miscopied all these different times.
Mhm.
It absolutely invalidates that, because here we have effectively a time capsule taking us back 2,000 years, more than 2,000 years, to manuscripts, Old Testament writings. We find out they're the same things that we have copied down for the next 1,100 years. I think the Aleppo manuscript is the oldest, outside of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest Hebrew writings that we have. And they're not that old. It's kind of surprising that the oldest Hebrew writings
Well, I
are
think the
not as
evil
old.
plates are now the oldest.
Yeah, that's true. That's right. Yes. But the Aleppo manuscript was the oldest manuscript of the Old Testament that existed in Hebrew. It wasn't, like I said, it's only about 1,000 years old, less than that. And so the question was, well, did they copy it right? Well, here we have a time capsule going back another 1,000 years with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we realized, yeah, they were copying it exactly right. They were doing exactly those things. And somebody comes along and says, no, these things were written much later. I was debating with a guy not too long ago who was trying to tell me that all of the Old Testament was written during the Ptolemaic period in Egypt. He was confused with the Septuagint. He had mixed up the two. And I was just trying to tell him, man, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're real. I don't think he believed it. And so you get to a point where people are starting to say, I don't even believe the Dead Sea Scrolls are real. I don't believe there is a Middle East. I don't believe there is a city of Jerusalem. At some point, it's that ridiculous. At some point, it's so ridiculous. I don't think there is a Rome, that you're just really left. What do we keep saying? We're talking about a trial where you've brought up your eyewitnesses and they are being grilled intensely. Now, by the way, in a real courtroom, the judge would stop it by saying, hey, you're badgering the witness. But in this courtroom, the skeptics badger the witnesses to no end. And the witnesses, which are the Old Testament, the New Testament writers, they are consistently accurate without contradiction. They demonstrate that they are verified eyewitnesses of these events. Their testimony in this trial of the veracity of the Bible is exemplary. And the skeptics cannot stand it.
Yeah, and that's it. When you think about the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's preserving the Bible or at least the Old Testament in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. And what we're finding is that where we find passages written in one and written in the other, they agree with one another. And that you've got the great Isaiah scroll, the great scroll I mentioned a few minutes ago. It comes from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it's a large section of Isaiah. It's 54 columns and contains at least pieces of all 66 chapters of the Hebrew version of the biblical book of Isaiah. I'm just reading that right now, and dates back to this one scroll, not older scrolls there, but this one scroll dates back to 125 years BCE. So you're talking about 125 years BC. That I think the thing that's so frustrating, you use the idea of the courtroom, is we'll accept the works of Plato and Aristotle as genuine, even though there aren't very many copies of that of what those guys actually wrote, and most of them found were hundreds of years removed from the time that they lived. And I'm trying to remember all the data on this. That we'll accept that the Iliad and the Odyssey are as the original author intended, even though there were very few surviving pieces of those manuscripts to put together. When you look at the Bible, there are, and I'm going to pull up some information here that I looked at just the other day. When you look at the Bible, it's not just based on eyewitness testimony. It is the weight of the evidence. There are 5,800 complete or fragmented Greek manuscripts, Greek and Hebrew manuscripts that we have to look at. that are all written within a few centuries of the original, if not even closer. There are 10,000 Latin manuscripts. There are 9,300 old New Testament pieces. That the oldest New Testament manuscript dates back to the early 2nd century, and it's a portion of the Gospel of John. So you're talking about, you're rolling over 100 AD, and we've got a piece of the Gospel of John that dates back that far. The Bible isn't refuted by true scholars. It's refuted by armchair skeptics who don't consider the fact that you have more than 20,000 pieces of evidence to say everything that you read in the Bible is basically as it's always been. You know, barring a few passages where, you know, a number might have been confused, 20,000 or 2,000. Things like that are really kind of immaterial things, that the Bible has accurately predicted what we would find historically. It's named actual figures. It has prophesied things about Jesus hundreds of years before he walked on this earth. If these later, the copies of Isaiah date back to 125 years before Jesus walked on the earth. That's, it doesn't matter that it wasn't written, that particular copy wasn't written 700 years before Jesus. It's still 125 years before Jesus, and contains many of those prophecies that we talked about. That it's not just the eyewitness testimony. It is the sheer volume of it. And it is modern hubris to not even want to acknowledge that guys like Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, Johannes Kepler all looked at the Bible and said, yeah, my discovery, whether it's planetary motion or it's gravity and physics or it's, modern chemistry, validates exactly what I see in the Word of God. There's a want to behind this. There's not a lack of evidence supporting the Bible. There's not a lack of internal evidence in the terms of fulfilled prophecy. It is just a desire for it not to be true.
Right on. That's exactly it.
And like you said, I think Daniel is one of those books that frustrates people. It frustrates people that it is so hard to place. It defies any ability to scrutinize, except to just say, I don't want to place it then because it doesn't make any sense. There's no reason not to believe that Daniel doesn't go back that far. He's naming kings. He's naming events that happened that wouldn't have been recorded otherwise. Well, we're at an hour and 15, so that's long for us. Do you have anything else you want to say on prophecy?
I've got a lot I want to say on prophecy.
Well, bring it out. We can go an hour and a half.
No, that's okay. We're going to stop here.
Okay, we'll do another episode specifically
because there's just so much to think about. Prophecy,
yeah, there really
is really a remarkable thing. I was just thinking when you were talking earlier, I'll just throw out one comment and I'll be done. That the Bible doesn't just say Jesus is born in Bethlehem. It says he's born in Bethlehem, goes to Egypt, he's brought up in Galilee. Those are the prophecies about Jesus's upbringing. That's
part of that 48.
Yeah, that's incredible, by the way. And again, that was such a complicated compilation of prophecy that the book of John tells us that they can't even follow it in Jesus's time. They're struggling to kind of figure this stuff out in Jesus's time, even though the prophet said, this will happen, this will happen, this will happen. Even in Jesus' time, they're saying, where could he be from? I thought he's from Bethlehem, but he's from Nazareth. How does that work? Bible told us how.
Yeah. And that's really it, that the Bible tells us how it works. That would be like saying Jared's going to be born in Houston, Texas. He's going to live in Deer Park, Texas. He's going to move to Centerville, Texas, and then for some reason end up in Portland, Oregon. That if you could tell me that 700 years before I was born, I would think, okay, obviously these people knew some stuff. It is amazing. And so why don't you close us out with your closing thoughts on this, and then I'll give mine.
There is no reason anybody could say that the Bible, there's no even hint that anybody could pull out and accuse the Bible of being historically invalid. The
Mhm.
Bible is probably and again, supernatural elements aside, the Bible is probably the best historical text in human history. And again,
Yeah.
all supernatural, spiritual evidence aside, the historical testimony of the Bible is phenomenal.
Mhm.
And as we said in the beginning, it's a good thing for historians to remember you don't bet against the Bible. And time again, the Bible wins every time it's put up to that historical challenge.
Mhm. Well, and the thing I think I want to point out is, and this is something that I was called out for in some other videos, and I'm not. If somebody calls me out, I'm not bitter. I might be a little bit. I might give as good as I get, kind of in the response that I try to make my tone match the tone of the comment. But this was somebody saying, I don't really need this. Why do we need this to help shape our faith? This is not the base. As I said in the reply, this is not the basis for your faith, but it can inform your faith. It can make your faith stronger. And if you are a skeptic or you are somebody who just doesn't know about the Bible, I would hope that it would be a reason that you would go and take a look at it. And yes, I know the Bible has some supernatural things in it, but if it's right about historical things that we've said it's wrong about for years, maybe it's right about the supernatural things too. Maybe the God that preserved the record of things like how language spread across the earth, how ancient civilizations like Nineveh and Jericho and the Hittites, that the same God that preserved a record of them, that proved that there really was written language about the time that Israel came out of Egypt. Maybe that God is able to do a lot more than just record history. Maybe he's able to send somebody to redeem you from your sin. And that's really why this is important, is it just adds a little bit of proof, a little bit of information for our faith to not just be in a vacuum, but to have a little bit of a tangible element. So not a reason for faith, but definitely something that can inform our faith. Well, Brian, I had fun with this episode. This is kind of your episode because this was a history thing, and I love history, but dude, you love history. So I hope you had fun with it. I hope the audience had fun with it. It that if you listen, I would encourage you to go watch this one on YouTube as well, because there, some of the graphics that Brian put up were really helpful to see what he's talking about. But if you are wanting to know more, we're going to talk next week about 5 claims the Bible makes about itself. I do have a couple of guests lined up for some later episodes. Chris Huntley is going to be with us, I think 2 weeks from now. That we were sort of talking about that the other day, and he was excited about some of the episode ideas I had for him. And I've got a couple of other guys that I need to follow up with, but we're going to be joined by some guests. And if you just completely disagree with anything that we've said and you want to come on and sort of debate it, as long as we can keep it follow some decorum rules, then we'd be happy to have you on. Those make for fun episodes. We hadn't done one like that yet, but if you completely disagree with us, be sure to message me on YouTube and leave a comment and say you'd like to come on and discuss it, and we'll talk about the possibility of doing that. So for all of us here at Biblically Speaking, for Brian and myself and future guests and guests that have been on the other episodes that I do, I want to say have a good day and God bless.